The wind howled like a dying animal against the frosted timbers of the isolated cabin, but the sound of the heavy oak doors splintering inward was louder. Abigail scrambled backward, clutching a rusted iron poker as the blizzard blew into her meager sanctuary. A colossal figure filled the doorframe, draped in snow-caked bearskin, his face hidden beneath a rugged beard and the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He stepped inside, throwing a blood-stained piece of parchment onto the wooden table. It was her husband's handwriting. The giant locked eyes with her, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the roaring storm. "Your husband's debt is paid," the mountain man growled. "Your body is mine." The Bitterroot Mountains of the Montana Territory, in the winter of 1883, were an unforgiving wasteland, a jagged stretch of earth that swallowed weak men whole. Josiah Thornton had always been a weak man, though he masked it with a cruel hand and a silver tongue. When he had left Abigail alone in their remote, half-finished cabin 3 weeks ago, promising to return from the mining camp at Elkhorn with flour, sugar, and the wealth he claimed was rightfully theirs, she had secretly prayed the mountain would keep him. Her prayers had been answered, though the cost was now standing in her living room, tracking snow and mud across her braided rug. Abigail Thornton's heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was 24, her features hollowed by months of meager rations and the heavy toll of an unhappy marriage. But her spine was forged of harder stuff than her late husband's. She kept the iron fireplace poker raised, her knuckles white. The stranger shut the shattered door behind him, shoving a heavy wooden bench against it to keep the howling blizzard at bay. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, towering well over 6 feet. He stripped away his snow-laden bearskin coat to reveal worn leather suspenders stretching over a thick flannel shirt. A heavy hunting knife rested on his hip, right beside a Colt single-action revolver. His face was weathered, deeply tanned even in winter, and a jagged, pale scar cut through the rugged dark beard on his left cheek. His eyes, however, were what truly terrified her. They were a piercing, icy gray, devoid of any warmth or mercy. "Get out," Abigail commanded, though her voice betrayed a slight tremble. "You have no right to be here." The man didn't flinch. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, bringing with him the smell of pine smoke, wet leather, and something distinctly wild. He stopped at the small dining table and tapped a thick, calloused finger against the crumpled parchment he had thrown down moments before. "Name's Stephen Caldwell," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "And I have every right. Read it." Abigail kept the poker raised with one hand while she used the other to snatch the paper. The light from the dying hearth was dim, but she recognized the frantic, looping scrawl of Josiah's handwriting instantly. At the bottom was his signature, and pressed over it was a rust-colored, smeared thumbprint. "Blood. I, Josiah Thornton, being of sound mind, do hereby forfeit my deed, my claims, and the entirety of my property, including my wife, Abigail Thornton, to Stephen Caldwell in exchange for the forgiveness of my debt of $1,000 and the sparing of my life." The date was marked 4 days ago. "He sold me," Abigail whispered, the horror creeping up her throat like bile. She looked back up at the towering man. "Where is he? Where is Josiah?" "Dead," Stephen answered flatly, showing no remorse. Sparing his life didn't last long. He tried to run a crooked game of faro in a saloon down in Red Lodge the very next night, caught a bullet in the neck from a drunken ranch hand. But the contract was signed before that. He owed me for a stolen shipment of pelts and a string of horses he rustled from my camp last spring. "And you think this piece of paper makes me your property?" Abigail spat, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surging, blinding rage. Josiah had abused her, isolated her, and now, from beyond the grave, he had sold her like a head of cattle. Stephen took a step closer. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He easily swatted the heavy iron poker from her grasp. It clattered uselessly against the stone hearth. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm, unyielding, yet surprisingly lacking the bruising malice she was accustomed to from Josiah. "Your body is mine," the mountain man growled, his face inches from hers. "This cabin is mine. The clothes on your back belong to me. You work for me now, widow. You'll cook, you'll clean, and you'll earn off every penny of that $1,000 your worthless husband stole from my livelihood. Understand?" Abigail glared up into those icy gray eyes. She was utterly alone, miles from civilization, trapped in a blizzard with a man who could snap her neck with one hand. But she would not break. "I am not a slave, Mr. Caldwell, and I am not a whore." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps respect, flashed in Stephen's eyes before it was quickly buried under his gruff exterior. "I didn't ask for a whore," he muttered, releasing her abruptly. He turned his back to her, moving toward the hearth to stoke the dying fire. "I asked for a worker. The storm is setting in. It'll blow for 3 days at least. Boil some water. I'm starving." Abigail stood frozen for a moment, rubbing her shoulders where his hands had been. The reality of her situation settled heavily upon her. She was the captive of a wild man in a frozen wilderness. But as she watched Stephen crouch by the fire, breathing life into the embers, a quiet, dangerous thought took root in her mind. "I survived Josiah. I will survive you, too." The first week of captivity was a silent, grueling war of wills. The blizzard raged outside, burying the cabin under 4 feet of snow, turning the small structure into a claustrophobic wooden cage. Stephen was a hard, demanding taskmaster, just as he had promised. He expected a hot meal before dawn, the cabin floor swept, and his heavy boots oiled. Yet, as the days bled into one another, Abigail noticed an unsettling difference between Stephen Caldwell and the men she had known. Josiah had demanded servitude to feed his ego, punishing her with his fists when she fell short. Stephen demanded labor, because survival in the mountains required it. He didn't sit idle while she worked. He chopped the firewood, reinforced the roof against the heavy snow, and repaired the hunting traps in the corner of the room. He worked twice as hard as she did. Furthermore, he never laid a hand on her again. At night, he threw his bedroll across the threshold of the front door, leaving the single bedroom entirely to her. He was an impenetrable wall of a man, speaking only in grunts or short, authoritative sentences. One evening, on the 8th day of the storm, the tension between them shifted. Stephen was sitting by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shh, shh, shh filled the quiet cabin. Abigail was mending a tear in one of Josiah's old flannel shirts, a garment she had taken to wearing over her dress for warmth. Suddenly, Stephen hissed through his teeth, dropping the whetstone. Abigail looked up to see a dark ribbon of blood trailing down his palm. He had slipped, the razor-sharp edge slicing deep into the meat of his hand. Without a word, he grabbed a rag from the hearth and wrapped it tightly around the wound. His jaw clenched tight. He tried to tie it off with his teeth and his free hand, but the thick fabric was clumsy. Abigail set her sewing down. She hesitated, the instinct to avoid a wounded, angry beast fighting against her natural inclination to help. Slowly, she stood and walked over to him. "Give it to me," she said softly. Stephen looked up, his gray eyes guarded. "I can manage. You're bleeding all over my clean floor, Mr. Caldwell. Give me your hand." For a long moment, he stared at her, the dancing firelight casting long shadows across his scarred face. Reluctantly, he extended his large, calloused hand toward her. Abigail unwrapped the dirty rag and tossed it into the fire. She brought over her sewing kit, a basin of warm water, and a clean strip of cotton. As she washed the blood from his palm, she felt the sheer strength coiled in his muscles. His hands were battered, scarred by weather, violence, and hard labor, a stark contrast to her pale, delicate fingers. "It needs stitches," she murmured, threading a needle with clean silk thread. "This is going to hurt. I've had worse," he muttered. As she pushed the needle through his tough skin, He didn't so much as flinch. Abigail worked quickly.
This story was posted
her
on the
face
channel The
mere
Rusty
inches
Saddle.
from his arm.
Please do not repost
She could smell
it in
the
any
musk
form.
of him, wood smoke, pine, and masculine sweat. It wasn't an unpleasant smell. It was grounded, real. "How did you get the scar?" she asked quietly, nodding toward his cheek, surprised by her own boldness. Stephen was quiet for so long she thought he would ignore the question. "Grizzly," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "5 years ago, up near the Canadian border, tracked me for 2 days. Caught me while I was dressing a deer." "You survived a grizzly bear attack alone?" "Killed it with a knife," he said matter-of-factly. "Lost a lot of blood. Crawled 3 miles to a trapper's camp. Taught me a lesson about this country. It doesn't care if you're strong or weak, good or bad. It only respects the ones who refuse to die." Abigail tied off the stitch and snipped the thread. She looked up, catching his gaze. For the first time, she saw past the imposing, terrifying exterior of the mountain man. She saw the profound loneliness that echoed her own. "Josiah was like a grizzly," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Except he lived in my house, and I wasn't allowed to have a knife." Stephen's jaw tightened. He looked down at the neat stitches on his palm, then back up to her face. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his thick fingers tentatively, almost reverently, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to Abigail's chest, stealing her breath. "You're not his anymore, Abigail," Stephen said, his voice softer than the winter snow falling outside. "You belong to me now, and I protect what's mine." He withdrew his hand quickly, as if the contact had burned him, and turned back to the fire. Abigail stood up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm, the dynamic between them forever altered in the quiet space of that cabin. He was her captor, her master by law of an illegal contract, yet she felt safer in his presence than she had in years. By the time the 3rd week passed, the brutal grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the Bitterroot Range. The snowpack receded, revealing the muddy, frozen earth beneath, and the dripping of icicles from the eaves became a constant daytime melody. The truce between Abigail and Stephen had deepened into a silent companionship. They moved around the small cabin in a synchronized dance, anticipating each other's needs. Stephen brought in fresh game rabbits and wild turkey, and Abigail cooked them with the wild onions and dried herbs she had stashed away. They sat by the fire at night, Stephen carving wood while Abigail read from an old, battered Bible, the only book Josiah hadn't burned for kindling. One afternoon, while Stephen was out checking his perimeter traps, Abigail decided to thoroughly clean the stone hearth. The ash had built up significantly during the long blizzard. As she swept the broom deep into the back corner of the fireplace, the bristles caught on a loose stone. She tugged at it, and the heavy rock shifted with a grinding noise, revealing a dark, hollow cavity beneath the floorboards. Curious, Abigail knelt in the soot and reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She gripped the handle and pulled out a heavy iron lockbox. It was covered in rust and ash, but the padlock on the front hung open, broken by a heavy blow. She opened the lid, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside, gleaming dully in the afternoon light, were several heavy leather pouches. She untied the nearest one, and a stream of solid gold nuggets poured into her palm. There was enough wealth in this box to buy a massive ranch in California, to live like royalty in San Francisco. "Josiah, what did you do?" she whispered, staring at the fortune. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the melting snow outside pulled her from her shock. The door swung open, and Stephen ducked inside. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from Abigail to the gold spilling from her hands. His expression darkened instantly. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking the pouch from her hand and inspecting the nuggets. He dug into the box, pulling out a tarnished silver medallion stamped with a distinct logo, 2 crossed pickaxes over a mountain peak. The Blackwood Mining Company. "Stephen?" Abigail asked, stepping back from the fury radiating off him. "What is it?" "Your husband was a worse fool than I thought," Stephen growled, tossing the medallion back into the box. "This isn't panned gold. This is payroll, stolen from the Blackwood Company. It made the papers in Helena 2 months ago. A transport carriage was robbed, 3 guards shot dead. They never caught the men who did it." Abigail's blood ran cold. Josiah was gone for a week around that time. "He said he was hunting. He was running with cutthroats," Stephen corrected, his mind working quickly. He paced the room, running a hand through his thick hair. This explains the $1,000 he suddenly had to pay off his gambling debts, and why he was so desperate to sign you over to me and get out of town. He knew the Blackwood boys, or worse. The men he robbed that coach with were looking for him. He hid the lion's share here. "We have to turn it in," Abigail panicked, the fear returning. "We can take it to the marshal in Elkhorn." "We can't do that," Stephen said grimly. "Anyone caught with this gold will swing from a rope. The Blackwood men don't wait for judges." Before Abigail could argue, a sound outside froze them both. It wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, distinct bark of a hound, followed by the whinny of horses. Lots of them. Stephen immediately blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the gloomy gray light of the overcast afternoon. He moved to the window, peering out through a crack in the shutters. Abigail crept up beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Down in the clearing, emerging from the tree line, were 6 men on horseback. They were heavily armed, wearing long dusters and wide-brimmed hats. At the front of the pack rode a man on a massive roan stallion. He had a cruel, narrow face and a silver star pinned to his lapel that Abigail knew was entirely fake. "Arthur Pendleton," Stephen whispered, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt at his hip. "Who is he?" Abigail asked, terrified. "A bounty hunter. Works exclusively for the Blackwood Mining Company. He's a butcher." "Abigail, he leaves no witnesses." Stephen turned to her, his icy gray eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen. He grabbed the heavy iron lockbox and shoved it under the floorboards, kicking the loose stone back into place. "Listen to me," Stephen said, gripping her arms. "Pendleton is tracking Josiah. He doesn't know Josiah's dead, and he sure as hell doesn't know I'm here. When they knock, you answer. You tell them Josiah left a month ago and you haven't seen him since. What about you? I'm going out the back window. I'll circle around through the timber. If they get violent, drop to the floor." "Stephen, please don't leave me alone with them," she pleaded, grabbing his thick forearms, her knuckles white. She realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that the thought of losing the mountain man frightened her more than the armed killers outside. Stephen looked down at her hands, holding on to him. The hard lines of his face softened for a fraction of a second. "I'm not leaving you, widow. I told you, you belong to me, and no one takes what's mine." A heavy, violent pounding echoed on the front door, making the timber shake. "Mrs. Thornton," a reedy, cruel voice called out from the porch. "Open up in the name of the law. We have some questions about your husband, and we ain't asking politely." Stephen gave her one last, lingering look before turning and slipping silently out the small window at the rear of the cabin, disappearing into the cold Montana timber, leaving Abigail alone to face the ghosts of her husband's sins. The pounding on the heavy oak door reverberated through Abigail's chest, threatening to shatter her fragile composure. She waited until the echo died down, took a deep, shuddering breath, and unlatched the heavy iron bolt. Arthur Pendleton pushed the door open before she could fully step back, his boots tracking muddy slush onto her braided rug. He was a lean, wiry man with a face like tanned leather and eyes that held the cold, unblinking stare of a reptile. Behind him filed 3 other men, rough-hewn and heavily armed. One of them, a hulking brute with a missing front tooth and a bowler hat, immediately began kicking over chairs and overturning baskets. "Where is he, Mrs. Thornton?" Pendleton drawled, casually pulling a silver pocket watch from his vest. "Josiah has a substantial debt with my employers, and I am here to collect." "He isn't here," Abigail said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. She backed away
This
toward the
story
stone
was posted
hearth,
on the
her
channel The
eyes
Rusty
darting
Saddle.
between the men.
Please do not repost
He
it
left
in
a
any
month ago
form.
for the Elkhorn camps. I haven't seen him since. Pendleton snapped his watch shut and slipped it away. He stepped closer, the stench of stale whiskey and chewing tobacco rolling off him. "Now, that's a shame, because we found a horse matching his roan gelding dead in a ravine about 20 miles south of here, shot in the head. A man doesn't walk away from that in a blizzard, unless he's headed for the nearest warm bed." "I told you, he isn't here," she repeated. The brute in the bowler hat, whom Pendleton called Cobb, suddenly stopped his ransacking near the wash basin. He picked up Stephen's straight razor and held up a massive, snow-caked leather boot that had been drying by the fire, a boot twice the size of anything Josiah could wear. "She's lying, boss," Cobb grunted. "Unless Josiah sprouted another 2 feet of height, she's got company, big company." Pendleton's eyes narrowed, his gaze drifting slowly over Abigail. "Well, now." The grieving wife didn't waste much time. "Who is he, Abigail? Where is he hiding the Blackwood payroll?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, though her heart pounded against her ribs. She thought of Stephen out in the freezing timber, outnumbered and exposed. Pendleton sighed, a sound of feigned disappointment. He drew his Colt revolver in one fluid, terrifyingly fast motion, and pressed the cold steel barrel against Abigail's cheek. "I am not a patient man. I know Josiah stole the company gold, and I know he brought it here. You have 10 seconds to tell me where it is, or I'll blow a hole through your pretty face and tear this cabin down log by log." "1," Cobb sneered, cocking his own rifle. Abigail closed her eyes, preparing for the end. "Drop to the floor," Stephen had told her. 2. Before Pendleton could reach 3, the small rear window of the cabin exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. A heavy, roaring blast from a Winchester rifle tore through the confined space. Cobb, the brute in the bowler hat, let out a wet gasp as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the far wall. "Get down," Pendleton bellowed, diving behind the overturned dining table as a second shot shattered the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling rafter. Abigail didn't hesitate. She threw herself flat against the rough-hewn floorboards, covering her head as deafening gunfire erupted. The cabin filled with thick, acrid white smoke. Pendleton's remaining men fired blindly out the broken window, their bullets chewing into the pine trees outside. From the tree line, Stephen was a ghost. He didn't fire rapidly. He fired with deadly, calculated precision. A third shot cracked through the frigid air, and one of the men firing out the window dropped his rifle, clutching his shattered knee with a scream of agony. "He's in the trees! Flank him!" Pendleton shouted over the din, returning fire with his revolver. But Stephen was already moving. Suddenly, the front door, which Pendleton had left ajar, kicked wide open. Stephen stood in the doorway, a towering silhouette against the gray afternoon light, his Winchester smoking in his massive hands. Before the remaining uninjured thug could turn his weapon, Stephen fired from the hip, catching the man in the chest. Pendleton, realizing the tide had turned, scrambled backward like a cornered rat. He aimed his Colt at Stephen, but the mountain man was faster. Stephen's rifle barked one last time, striking Pendleton's revolver and blowing the weapon out of the bounty hunter's hand, taking 2 of his fingers with it. Pendleton screamed, clutching his bloody, mangled hand. He scrambled out the back window, tumbling into the snow and sprinting toward the tree line where their horses were tied, leaving his dead and wounded men behind. The silence that followed was ringing and heavy. Stephen stepped into the cabin, his icy gray eyes scanning the carnage. He lowered the rifle and immediately looked toward the hearth. "Abigail," he breathed, his rough voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite mask. She pushed herself up from the floor, trembling violently, her dress covered in soot and glass. Stephen crossed the room in 2 massive strides, dropping to one knee beside her. His large hands roamed over her shoulders, her arms checking for bullet holes. "I'm all right," she choked out, staring at the bodies on her floor. "I'm alive." Stephen let out a harsh, ragged breath. He pulled her against his chest, holding her tight. The smell of gun smoke and pine surrounded her, and for the first time since she was a little girl, Abigail let herself cry, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat. He was a hard man, a killer, and her legal captor. Yet, in his arms, she had never felt safer. The reprieve was short-lived. "Pendleton will be back," Stephen said gruffly, pulling away just enough to look her in the eyes. "He's running to the nearest telegraph office. Once he wires the Blackwood Company, there will be 50 men riding up that mountain with hanging ropes. We have to go. Now." Abigail didn't argue. She sprang into action, moving with a frantic, focused energy. She grabbed Josiah's old canvas duffel bag and stuffed it with the remaining dried meat, flour, matches, and woolen blankets. Stephen, meanwhile, dragged the wounded men out onto the porch, a grim but necessary act to secure the cabin and retrieve the iron lockbox from beneath the hearth. "Are we taking the gold?" she asked, watching him shove the heavy leather pouches into his saddlebags. "Leaving it here guarantees they'll hunt us for revenge. Taking it gives us a bargaining chip, or a way to disappear," Stephen replied, his jaw set in a hard line. "Besides, Pendleton isn't just a bounty hunter. He's the one who planned the robbery." Abigail stopped packing, staring at him. "What?" "The Blackwood Company is corrupt, but Pendleton is worse," Stephen explained rapidly as he checked his revolver. "He hires desperate fools like Josiah to hit the payroll transports, then hunts them down under the guise of the law, keeping the gold for himself. Josiah was a pawn. He just happened to be smart enough to hide the gold before Pendleton caught up with him." He slung his bags over his shoulder. "I used to ride security for Blackwood. I know how Pendleton works. If he catches us, he'll butcher us both and bury the truth." 10 minutes later, they were mounted on Stephen's 2 heavy draft horses, leaving the bullet-riddled cabin behind. The winter sun was beginning to set, casting long, bleeding shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted, freezing the muddy tracks they left behind. They rode hard into the teeth of the Bitterroot Range, climbing higher into the treacherous mountain passes where the snow was still deep and the air was razor-thin. Stephen led the way, navigating the perilous, icy ledges with the instinct of a wolf. Abigail followed closely, trusting the broad expanse of his back more than her own eyes. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, biting through Abigail's layers of wool. They sought shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall, a spot Stephen knew from his trapping days. Stephen built a small, smokeless fire deep in the back of the cave, using dry brush he'd stored there seasons ago. He handed Abigail a tin cup of melted snow and a piece of hardtack. "Eat," he commanded softly. Abigail took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact lingered. The adrenaline of the shootout was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, quiet intimacy. They were 2 outcasts, bound by a dead man's debt and a stolen fortune, hiding from the world in a frozen cave. "You came back for me," she said softly, staring into the small flames. "You could have kept running. Pendleton didn't know you were there. You could have left me to him and taken the gold later." Stephen sat across from her, his large frame casting a dancing shadow on the cave wall. He stared at his scarred hands for a long time, before looking up. The icy exterior he always wore seemed to melt away in the firelight, revealing the weary, solitary man beneath. "When Josiah handed me that contract," Stephen began, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the stone, "I took it because I wanted to punish him. I thought you'd be just like him, selfish, weak, cruel. I intended to work you to the bone to settle his score." He leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But you aren't him, Abigail. You're the strongest woman I've ever met. You survived him. You survived the winter, and you stood staring down the barrel of Pendleton's gun without breaking." Stephen reached across the fire, his rough, scarred hand gently cupping her soot-stained cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "I told you your body was mine
This
to
story was
command.
posted on the
I
channel
was
The
wrong.
Rusty Saddle.
It's my
Please do
life
not
that
repost
belongs
it
to
in
you
any
now.
form.
I'll burn this whole mountain down before I let them touch you." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes. She leaned into his touch, closing the distance between them. There were no contracts, no debts, and no ghosts between them in the cave. When Stephen leaned in and kissed her, it wasn't the harsh, demanding claim of a captor. It was desperate, tender, and deeply reverent, a promise forged in blood and survival. As they held each other in the dark, the howling wind outside seemed miles away. But both of them knew the truth. The blood trail they left behind was fresh, and the wolves were already gathering at the bottom of the mountain. Dawn broke over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, not with the gentle warmth of a new day, but with a harsh, blinding glare that reflected ruthlessly off the ice-crusted snowpack. The brutal blizzard had finally broken during the night, leaving the world wrapped in a deadly, freezing silence that felt heavy enough to crush the breath from their lungs. Stephen and Abigail broke camp long before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridges, their breath pluming like thick chimney smoke in the razor-thin, frigid air. Stephen knew this unforgiving territory like the back of his own scarred hand, but their progress was agonizingly slow. The heavy draft horses, beasts bred for pulling plows through soft valley dirt rather than navigating treacherous alpine ledges, struggled to find secure footing on the ice. Every step was a calculated risk. By midday, their muscles burning from the tension and the altitude, they reached a notorious, narrow pass, known to the local trappers as Dead Man's Drop. It was a precarious, wind-scoured trail barely 6 feet wide, flanked by a sheer, towering wall of dark granite on one side and a yawning, 200-foot chasm on the other. The wind howled through the gorge, threatening to tear them right off the mountain. Abigail's gloved hands were numb as they gripped the saddle horn, her eyes wide with a primal terror as she looked out over the dizzying drop. "Keep your eyes on my back, Abigail," Stephen called back over the roaring mountain wind. He was walking ahead, leading his massive horse by the reins, his broad shoulders serving as the only shield between her and the abyss. "Don't look down, just watch me." She focused on the worn leather of his suspenders, on the steady, rhythmic crunch of his boots breaking through the snow crust. Halfway across the perilous traverse, the wind momentarily died down. In that split second of eerie quiet, a sharp, echoing crack snapped through the canyon, a sound distinctly, terrifyingly different from the natural shifting of mountain ice. A heavy caliber bullet sparked violently against the granite wall mere inches from Stephen's head, showering his hat and shoulders with razor-sharp shards of stone. A heartbeat later, the thunderous, rolling report of a Sharp's rifle echoed up from the valley floor far below. "Move!" Stephen roared, his survival instincts taking over instantly. He slapped the heavy rump of Abigail's horse with his open palm. The beast surged forward, terrified by the deafening noise and the sudden strike, carrying Abigail in a frantic scramble toward the safety of the boulder field at the end of the narrow pass. Stephen drew his Winchester rifle from its scabbard in one fluid motion, using his own panicked horse as moving cover as he scanned the tree line far below. Through the glaring white expanse, his sharp gray eyes spotted the movement. It wasn't the mob of 50 angry townsmen he had feared. It was a tight, hardened posse of 8 riders, their dusters whipping in the wind. Leading them was Arthur Pendleton, his mangled hand wrapped in dirty, blood-soaked bandages, riding alongside a notorious local tracker named Stephen Deaf Calloway, a real-life scoundrel known across the Montana Territory for hunting men for pure sport. Pendleton hadn't wired the Blackwood Company. The greedy bastard was trying to keep the stolen payroll completely off the books, bringing his own personal gang of cutthroats to slaughter them quietly and claim the gold. "They've got us pinned," Abigail cried as she slid from her saddle, dragging her horse behind a massive, jutting limestone outcropping, just as another volley of gunfire chewed into the rocks around them. the air filled with the sharp, acrid scent of pulverized stone and gun smoke. "They have the low ground, but they have rifles that can reach us." Stephen grunted, dropping heavily into the snow beside her. He checked his ammunition, his face a mask of grim calculation. He had exactly 14 rounds left. "Pendleton knows we can't hold this ridge forever. He's going to send his men up the switchback on foot while Calloway lays down covering fire." Abigail's heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the heavy leather saddlebags resting near their snow-caked boots, bulging with the cursed Blackwood payroll. The gold that had started all of this. Give them the gold, Stephen. Throw it over the edge. Let them see it fall. It's what they want. "Pendleton doesn't leave witnesses, Abigail." "You know that," Stephen said, his voice deadly calm. He shifted his weight, his icy gray eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gripping hers so tightly she could feel the heat radiating through his leather gloves. "I need you to listen to me. There is a cave system, a quarter-mile up this ridge, hidden behind a patch of dead pines. You take the horses and the gold. You ride hard. And you don't stop until you reach the federal marshal in Missoula." "No," Abigail breathed, the blood draining entirely from her face. The sheer thought of leaving him alone on this frozen ledge was more terrifying than the bullets whistling overhead. "I am not leaving you here to die. I'm going to buy you time," he insisted, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. "I'm a mountain man, Abigail. I know how to fight in the snow. I can hold them here. Now go." "I said no," Abigail shouted. The ferocity in her own voice shocked her, ringing clear and defiant over the gunfire. The meek, terrified woman Josiah Thornton had married the woman who had cowered in the corner of a cabin was dead, buried under the snows of the Bitterroot. In her place stood a survivor. She reached over, her movements deliberate and unwavering, and pulled Stephen's heavy Colt revolver from its hip holster. She clutched the cold iron with both hands, feeling its lethal weight. "You said I belong to you, and you belong to me. We fight together, or we die together." For a long, suspended moment, the mountain man just stared at her. The gunfire around them seemed to fade into background noise. Then, a ghost of a smile touched Stephen's scarred face. He nodded slowly, a profound, overwhelming respect burning in his eyes. "All right, widow," he said softly. "Keep your head down. When they crest the ridge, aim for the center of their mass." For 20 agonizing minutes, the mountain was transformed into a blinding, deafening war zone. Stephen fired with deadly, methodical precision. Every time he worked the lever of the Winchester, brass casings spun into the snow, melting perfect little circles in the ice. He dropped 2 of Pendleton's men as they foolishly tried to rush the switchback, sending them tumbling back down the steep incline. But the sheer volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Lead rained against the limestone, throwing shards of rock into their faces. As Stephen leaned out to take a shot at Calloway, a bullet grazed his left thigh. It tore through the heavy wool of his trousers and deep into the muscle, drawing a sharp, violent hiss of pain from the giant. Stephen dropped back behind the rock, his hand instinctively clamping over the wound. Bright, arterial blood immediately began to soak the snow beneath him. Abigail gasped, reaching for him. But the firing from the valley floor suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and infinitely more terrifying than the gunfire. "They're flanking," Stephen warned, his breathing strained as he pressed his back against the freezing limestone. "Watch the cliff edge." He was right. A shower of loose gravel to their left heralded the arrival of 3 of Pendleton's thugs who had bypassed the main trail and scaled the sheer cliff face. They crested the ridge like wolves. Stephen swung his Winchester, dropping the first man instantly with a shot to the chest. He quickly worked the lever to chamber another round, but the rifle's action ceased, jamming a warped brass casing perfectly in the breech. The second thug, realizing the mountain man was compromised, raised a double-barreled shotgun, his finger tightening on the triggers. Bang! The deafening roar came from right beside Stephen's ear. Abigail stood tall, the wind tearing at her hair, her hands trembling
This story
violently
was
as thick
posted on
white
the channel
smoke
The
curled
Rusty
from the
Saddle.
barrel of the
Please do
Colt.
not repost
The
it in any
recoil had
form.
nearly knocked her off her feet, snapping her wrists back. The second thug crumpled backward, a crimson bloom spreading rapidly across his chest. He hit the ground, dead before he realized what had happened. Before Abigail could cock the heavy hammer again, the third man lunged with a feral scream, tackling Stephen over the icy rocks. The two massive men rolled violently toward the perilous edge of the chasm, locked in a brutal, desperate struggle for survival. Stephen, severely weakened by the rapid blood loss from his leg, fought desperately to keep the man's jagged hunting knife away from his throat. The thug had the high ground, pressing his weight down, the steel inching closer to Stephen's skin. Abigail scrambled forward on her hands and knees, the heavy revolver feeling like a block of lead. She aimed, but the men were a thrashing blur of limbs and coats. She couldn't get a clear shot without risking putting a bullet in Stephen. Just as the thug raised his blade for a final, killing strike, Stephen roared. It was a sound born of raw, untamed wilderness. Channeling every ounce of strength he had left, Stephen shifted his weight, driving his heavy, iron-toed boot squarely into the man's stomach. With a massive heave, he launched the thug up and over his body. The man screamed, a long, fading wail of terror that dissolved into nothingness as he plummeted into the 200-foot abyss. Stephen collapsed onto the blood-stained snow, gasping raggedly for air, his hand weakly clutching his bleeding leg. But it wasn't over. Stepping out from the dark shadows of the rocks, his boots crunching softly on the ice, was Arthur Pendleton. His narrow face was twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He held a silver revolver in his uninjured left hand, pointing it squarely at Stephen's head. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Caldwell," Pendleton spat, slowly thumbing back the hammer. His eyes shifted momentarily to Abigail. "And you, Mrs. Thornton. You should have just stayed a quiet little widow." Abigail was 10 feet away. Pendleton's eyes were entirely focused on the bleeding mountain man. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. She raised the heavy Colt, aimed it directly down the sights just as Josiah had lazily shown her years ago, and pulled the trigger. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. In the chaos, she hadn't kept count of the rounds. Pendleton snapped his head toward her, the sound of the dry fire echoing loudly. A cruel, mocking laugh escaped his thin lips. He slowly shifted his aim away from Stephen, leveling the barrel directly at Abigail's chest. "Ladies first," he sneered. A sudden, booming explosion shattered the mocking laughter. Pendleton froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He looked down at his chest, where a massive, gaping hole had instantly materialized. Stephen lay flat on his back, his smoking, unjammed Winchester resting firmly against his hip. While Pendleton had been momentarily distracted by the empty click of Abigail's gun, the mountain man had ruthlessly cleared the breach with one hand. The corrupt bounty hunter swayed in the wind like a felled timber. His silver revolver slipped from his grasp before he collapsed face first into the bloody snow, dead before he hit the ground. The journey down the mountain and into the bustling timber town of Missoula was a grueling, agonizing blur of pain, freezing winds, and sheer, desperate willpower. The fierce blizzard had passed, but the bitter cold remained, biting through their damp wool clothing and threatening frostbite with every mile. Stephen was a giant of a man, built to withstand the harshest elements the frontier could throw at him, but the bullet wound in his thigh was taking a devastating toll. He bled steadily, the crimson staining the pristine white snow beneath his horse's hooves. For the first time since he had kicked down her door, the roles were entirely reversed. Abigail was no longer the captive widow. She was the protector. She stopped them every few miles, her hands numb and trembling as she tore long, ragged strips from her own heavy woolen dress. She bound his thick leg as tightly as she could, pressing her weight against the wound to stem the bleeding, while Stephen ground his teeth against the searing pain. She navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked mountain trails, not with the seasoned expertise of a tracker, but with a primal instinct born of necessity and a fervent prayer to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. She kept Stephen upright in the saddle, sometimes tying his belt to the saddle horn when his heavy head began to droop, her voice a constant, reassuring anchor in the freezing wilderness. She spoke of the valley, of warm fires, of anything to keep him tethered to the waking world. 3 days later, half-starved, exhausted, and running on the last fumes of their adrenaline, they rode into Missoula. The town was a muddy, chaotic sprawl of timber mills and saloons, a jarring contrast to the silent, deadly isolation of the high peaks. Abigail wisely steered them clear of the local sheriff's office. Stephen had warned her in his lucid moments that local lawmen were too easily bought by Blackwood mining money. They needed federal authority. They went straight to the telegraph office. Stephen slid from his horse, his bad leg buckling beneath him, but he refused Abigail's desperate attempt to carry his weight. Drawing on a profound, stubborn reservoir of strength, he limped through the wooden doors. With a heavy, exhausted grunt, he slammed the rusted iron lockbox onto the telegraph operator's desk. The metallic crash made the clerk jump out of his chair. Stephen gripped the edge of the counter, his face pale and dripping with cold sweat, his gray eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising light. He demanded the operator send a wire directly to U.S. Marshal Thomas Kane in Helena, a man renowned across the territory for his incorruptible nature and his deep-seated hatred for corporate vigilantes and hired guns. The next 2 days in a rented room above the town's apothecary were a tense vigil. Abigail rarely left Stephen's side. She cleaned his wound with boiled water and strong whiskey, her hands gentle but steady. The fever set in on the first night, rendering the stoic mountain man delirious. In his fevered muttering, he didn't speak of gold or bounty hunters. He spoke her name, apologizing for the contract, apologizing for the fear he had caused her. It was in those quiet, desperate hours, pressing cool rags to his burning forehead, that Abigail realized the absolute depth of her feelings for him. The debt between them had dissolved, replaced by a bond forged in the crucible of survival. When Marshal Kane finally arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, he found a town buzzing with wild rumors and a heavily armed mountain man sitting up in bed, his rifle resting across his knees. Stephen and Abigail surrendered the Blackwood payroll without hesitation. More importantly, they handed over the detailed, blood-stained ledgers Stephen had stripped from Pendleton's saddlebags on the mountain. Kane, a hardened man with a silver mustache and sharp eyes, read through the books in stony silence. The ledgers were a damning chronicle of corruption. They proved unequivocally that Pendleton had been orchestrating the stagecoach robberies himself, using desperate pawns like Josiah Thornton to do the dirty work, before hunting them down to keep the gold off the company's official books. The scandal immediately rocked the Montana territory. Within a week, the Blackwood Mining Company faced a massive, crippling federal investigation. Pendleton's surviving thugs were rounded up by Kane's deputies and sent in chains to the territorial prison. Because Stephen had voluntarily returned the stolen payroll and provided the crucial evidence needed to break the deadly corruption ring, Marshal Kane wielded his federal authority to grant Stephen a full, unconditional pardon for his past vigilante actions and any violence committed during the mountain shootout. It was deemed clear self-defense against a rogue, murderous outfit. Then, Kane turned his attention to the wrinkled, blood-thumbed parchment Stephen presented to him. The marshal read Josiah's contract with profound disgust. With a stroke of his pen and the weight of the United States government behind him, Kane declared the contract binding Abigail to Stephen as illegitimate, legally void, and morally abhorrent. She was a free woman. Her dead husband's terrible sins were completely washed away, and the suffocating debt that had bound her to the mountain man was officially canceled. A month later, the bitter, unyielding winter finally broke, surrendering to the brilliant, vibrant green of a Montana spring. The thaw brought life, rushing back to the territory, mirroring the profound shift in Abigail's own soul. She stood on the wide, wrap-around porch of a newly built, sturdy log cabin overlooking the sprawling, fertile valley of the Gallatin River. It wasn't an isolated, drafty shack meant to hide from the world. It was a true home, bathed in warm sunlight, built with the substantial federal reward money Marshall Kane had secured for them for exposing Pendleton's ring. Abigail wore a simple, clean cotton dress that caught the gentle spring breeze. Her face was full, rested, and radiant. The hollow, haunted look of the terrified widow was completely and forever gone. She watched the river waters rush over the smooth stones, a deep sense of peace settling into her bones. Heavy, familiar footsteps.
This story was
sounded
posted on the
wooden planks
channel The
behind
Rusty
her.
Saddle.
Stephen
Please do not
wrapped his
repost
massive
it in any
arms
form.
around her waist, pulling her back against his broad, solid chest. He buried his bearded face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of her hair. He moved without the limp now, his strength fully returned. "The horses are fenced, and the lower field is cleared," Stephen murmured, his deep, resonant voice vibrating against her back, sending a familiar thrill down her spine. Abigail leaned back into his secure embrace, placing her hands over his large, scarred ones where they rested on her stomach. "You work too hard, Mr. Caldwell." "I have a lot to protect, Mrs. Caldwell," he replied softly, turning her gently in his arms so he could look down into her eyes. The icy, unforgiving gray of his gaze was still there, but the harsh, unyielding wilderness that once defined him had been entirely replaced by a profound, unconditional warmth. He reached up, his rough thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw, marveling at the incredible strength of the woman who had saved his life when she had every reason to let him die. "You know, legally speaking, you don't owe me a thing anymore. You could have taken that reward money and gone back east, started fresh where it's safe." Abigail smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached her eyes. She reached up to run her fingers through his thick, dark hair, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her chest. "I paid Josiah's debt in blood and snow, Stephen," she said softly, her voice filled with absolute certainty. "But my heart? That belongs exactly where it is." He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, lingering promise made beneath the vast, endless blue of the western sky. The fierce mountain man had descended from his frozen, solitary fortress, not to conquer, but to finally be conquered by the love of the widow who had absolutely refused to break. "Your Body Is Mine" transforms a harrowing tale of captivity into a profound story of mutual salvation, set against the brutal backdrop of the 1,883 Montana frontier. The narrative explores the resilience of the human spirit when pushed to the absolute brink. Abigail's journey from a terrorized, traded possession to a fierce, gun-wielding survivor highlights a powerful reclamation of agency and self-worth. Conversely, Stephen's evolution from a cold, vengeful captor to a fiercely protective partner demonstrates that even the most hardened hearts can be thawed by courage and genuine connection. Together, they confront not only the physical dangers of corrupt bounty hunters and lethal blizzards, but the lingering ghosts of a toxic past. In the end, they forge a partnership built on absolute equality and hard-won trust, proving that true freedom isn't just about escaping a cage. It's about choosing who you stand beside when the wolves come to the door.